Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Talk. We are your hosts, Southborough Youth and Family Services. My name is Sarah Castle. I am the Director of Southborough Youth and Family Services. And with me this morning, we have Megan Island, who's our Assistant Director. Good morning, Megan.
Morning.
We have Shannon Knyman, who is our Program Coordinator. Good morning, Shannon.
Hi, Sarah.
And we have two guests today, so exciting. We have Southborough resident and parent of Southborough kids, Jennifer Drohan, with us. Good morning, Jennifer.
Morning.
And then we also have Cara Caissie, who is the jail diversion clinician for the town of Marlborough, but also a mobile crisis clinician for Wayside Family Network. Do I have that right, Cara?
You have it right. Thank you.
Beautiful. There's so much information there. Well, ladies, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. Let's start with our weekly coffee toast. We're starting a little earlier today, so we need our caffeine.
Me too.
So let's see, how's everybody doing this morning? Anything new and exciting happening for anyone?
No.
No.
Just another day in pandemic paradise.
Yes, I know. The weather is looking better though. I was on my way to work this morning and it was 40 degrees already and it just made me smile. I was thinking as we were starting this just now, that jingle, despite whatever it is that we're talking about on the show and starting our show with a coffee toast, both of those things make me smile and it's nice to be here together. So, well, we are here this morning. We're talking about emergency mental health services. We hope that no one watching the show finds themselves in a position of having to call 911 or access emergency mental health services. But you may find yourself in that place, and we feel it's important to know what your options are, as well as know what to expect. So this is actually part one of a 2-week series. Next week, we're going to be talking about some additional services. But for this week, we're going to be talking specifically about what options you have in the midst of a mental health crisis and what you might expect to happen when you try to access emergency mental health services. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the show about what we'll be talking about, but we'll be also reviewing some other services that are available to people that might help support a family before they get to the point of needing psychiatric emergency services. So Jennifer's here to talk to us about her own personal story and her experience with it. And Cara's here to round out our conversation on the other side to help us understand what to expect and some of the complexities of this system. So thank you, ladies, for both being here today to talk about this very important topic. So Jennifer, let's start with you. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about you, your family.
Sure. So I'm Jen Drohan, and I've been here in Southborough for about 3.5 years. We moved from Northborough, so not very far. I have 2 boys. I have a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old. And my 17-year-old is the one who has experienced some mental health challenges over the past few years. I just, thank you so much for having me on and allowing me to kind of tell my story in hopes that it will help some other people if they're in the same situation that I've been in.
Great.
So you actually reached out to us. So Jen is, she is a Coffee Talk viewer. She's one of 4.
Yeah.
And So Jen reached out to us because this is something that your family has experienced, and it's something that you find that other families have asked you questions about. So what was it that prompted you to reach out to us?
Well, I think because my son has experienced mental health issues, and um, you know, one of the main things I always want to do, I've been very open about his mental health issues, because first and foremost, I want to be able to squelch the stigma about mental illness. So I've been very open. And also, so many people who I've talked to who have gone through my journey have said to me, gosh, I wish I would have known this in the beginning. I wish I would have known, you know, no, I wish I would have had that information from the beginning, because it's such a difficult system to navigate. And it's not like medical services. So it's very, very different. I think also I reached out as well because pandemic has obviously put a tremendous strain on the mental health system, and particularly pediatric mental health. And I just wanted to be able to let people know that this is a system that's very strained. And so if there are options that you can take in the midst of a crisis, then that is going to be so helpful for everybody. And as you said, also, Sarah, nobody thinks that they're ever going to be in a mental health crisis situation. We certainly didn't. But if we can, if anyone is kind of heading in that direction or displaying signs of some mental health issues, the planning prior to that happening and the knowledge of what is available, I think in the midst of a crisis can be so helpful. And like I said, it's different than in a medical situation. When you have a medical problem, you go to the doctor. The doctor says, okay, you may need these tests, you may need a hospitalization, let's get you scheduled for that. But that's not what the mental health system is like. If you are in a crisis, you just don't get to say, I need hospitalization and get it. So there's a lot of things that need to be done prior to that. For instance, if you're in a crisis and you go to an ER, you need to be evaluated by their crisis team in order to then figure out what kind of services you need. Oftentimes it's not something that you decide yourself. It's something that the team decides for you. And if you are not needing an ER visit, and I think Cara will speak to this, what are the other things that you can do to try not to have to go that route if it's safe enough for you not to have to? So that's kind of why I wanted to come on. I also, there's some pitfalls and there's some mistakes I made. So, if ever I can kind of help somebody make sure that they don't make the same mistakes during a difficult time, then that would be great.
Well, thank you for using your experience to help others.
Sure.
For sure. And Jen, I think you kind of alluded to it, that it can be a long process too. I think that that's something that people don't understand or that they don't appreciate.
Yeah. And I think that, certainly with the pandemic, it's made kind of the timeline even longer. And, we, in our personal experience, we've waited quite a long time to get the services that we need, even in the ER setting. So I think not to scare anybody or prevent anybody from going to that route. It is not a quick
Right.
and easy solution. And I think if you go into that knowing that, you
Yeah.
can do some preparation,
Mhm.
because that wasn't kind of how I understood the mental health system. I thought you went to the ER that night, you got a bed at an inpatient hospitalization, and you were on your journey. And that was very frustrating to me. And in a kind of in a crisis situation, that just put a little bit more on my plate.
Yeah.
So had I known that there were maybe other services out there, I could have possibly utilized those services.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's highlighting knowing what to expect and how important it is to kind of have an idea of what to expect, and also knowing what other services, like you said, what other services are out there. So
Absolutely.
Jen, you mentioned mobile crisis, and we've covered this before on Coffee Talk, but it's important to remind people what it is and highlight the other options, like you said, that people have in a time of crisis. So Cara, can you talk a little bit about what mobile crisis is?
Yeah. So, obviously the pandemic has sort of altered the delivery of services in general, which I'm sure Jen can relate to that frustration of that shift, meaning that it's less in person and more remote, like we're doing today. That can be challenging. But mobile crisis is designed to provide an emergency service to evaluate and assess and a youth's condition at the time and their severity. And the number one thing we're always looking for is risk. So when we're utilizing that service, I mean, there's concern about imminent risk or maybe progressive chronic risk, things like that. And then, the mentality always is to keep people at the lowest level of care so they can be in their community and in their natural environment. And we don't want to destabilize people who are already predisposed to having crises and that are struggling to maintain their daily functioning. But if they do require stabilization, then we need to progressively increase level of care. There's different terms for services that exist. I'm sure, some of you may have heard of them, but the highest level of care is hospitalization, which is only accessed through an emergency room. And that's the only way you can get there. You can be assessed and meet level of care prior to arriving if you're seen in the community by mobile crisis. But you still need to go through the ER to access a hospital level of care admission. There's other types of services that are a little, lower levels of care that can be provided or referred while the client remains at home. And one of those is referred to as CBAT, which stands for Community-Based Acute Treatment. It's an overnight treatment. With Mass Health Insurance, you can stay at home. We call it boarding. And then you can access that once a bed is available. And, like Jen is describing, these things don't always happen as quickly or as in such a streamlined way that they should, which is really just due to lack of availability. And then there's other types of services that allow the client to remain at home. There's obviously outpatient therapy. There's also services through CBHI. So those types of services were more intensive, more frequent in-home therapy, things like that can be referred through mobile crisis as well. But again, the first and foremost is assessing for risk. Then there's also availability to do crisis counseling. We usually can remain open for 1 week at a time and then extend if needed, but that's the general idea. And then that way, when we can close out, there's supports in place or the crisis has stabilized.
I just had a question. You mentioned, well, firstly, CBHI was an acronym that you just mentioned, and I may have mentioned it also. It's stands for Children's Behavioral Health Initiative. And actually, those services are what we're going to be covering more in depth next week. But CBAT, which you mentioned, which is again, remind me what you just
It's
said.
community-based acute treatment, which is
Thank you.
also overnight stay, but it's a little lesser level of care. It's not a locked and secured unit, and the idea is a little bit longer. Hospitalization is really for stabilization, med assessment. It's brief, and sometimes clients may even step down to level of care to CBAT before returning home.
Yeah. And is that accessed only through an evaluation with somebody from Mobile Crisis also?
So you have to be fully assessed. A psychiatric evaluation is needed, which can be done through a mobile service. Same thing with partial hospitalization or day treatment, which is Monday through Friday, day structured therapeutic environment, but the client goes home each night. Those things, like a day treatment, can be referred by the client or the client's family, but it can help to have a psychiatric evaluation first, so they know what the goals are and what they're working with. But for CBAT and hospitalization, it comes through referral from a crisis team.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so we actually have a couple of resource related, so we're Southborough Youth and Family Services. We serve the Southborough community. So we're intending to share with you all some resources that are available to Southborough residents that we'll put in the comments at the end of the show. But we have some recommendations in terms of, I think the other couple of things to highlight, that there's also crisis lines that you can call. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a resource. I didn't know this was something that existed, but behavioral health urgent care. I think it depends on where you live. And I'm sure that looks different right now in times of COVID also. We had found a couple of places that offer walk-in availability through advocates and through Community Health Link. And then also Mobile Crisis, we will be sure to share the phone number for psychiatric emergency services through advocates, which covers Southborough. So we'll be sure to share that. So as Jen mentioned earlier, we certainly don't want to deter anybody from going forward with calling Mobile Crisis if they need it, or simply going right to the emergency room if they need it. But as both Cara and Jen have mentioned, that it can be a challenging system, and it can be very helpful to plan ahead for that. It's a very complex system with lots of moving parts, and I think unfortunately strained because of the level of need and availability, but also this pandemic has made it harder to provide services and be as responsive as we need to be. So Cara, maybe you could speak a little bit more about what people might expect when they make a phone call to psychiatric emergency services. And also, if you could you wear two hats, it's really neat to hear about. So I mentioned at the beginning of the show that Cara is a jail diversion clinician for the town of Marlborough, which means that she works along with the police department there and helps to respond to 911 phone calls for mental health emergencies. So when 911 is called, and it's a mental health emergency, she's often involved. And then on the other side, you also work as a mobile crisis clinician, which is sort of the difference between calling 911 or calling psychiatric emergency services, for example. So maybe you could talk about what people can expect on both of those fronts,
Mhm.
and then any other, nuances that you think are important for people to be aware of, even after that phone call.
Sure.
That was a long question. I apologize.
That's okay. I hope I get it all. If I don't, circle back, we'll start again. Um, we receive a very wide range of types of calls, and sometimes, and this is from a mobile crisis perspective. Um, Families have a different degree of what they feel comfortable with. And I think that's sometimes the evolution of their child's treatment and their progress. So, in the beginning, we get the first time calls from families who are just really worried about their child, and they're not sure what to do. Is this a full-blown crisis? Do we go to the ER? What do we need? And that might be as simple as, not simple, but as I guess with as little information as the child's routine has changed. They're not getting out of bed. So there's not necessarily imminent risk, but they're reaching out because there's a substantial shift in their functioning. And then we get calls, all the way to the other range where the child may be having an explosive outburst. They're extremely dysregulated. They're making threats to harm themselves or others. And in any event, when these phone calls are coming through to psychiatric emergency services, they're being screened and triaged. If there's no imminent risk pre-COVID, then you're going to get a crisis clinician to arrive at that location within an hour is what we try to do. Unfortunately, like we can't, teleport faster. So, I mean, there is that.
Mhm.
But that's where the difference comes between utilizing that service versus calling a police department or using 911 is if the client is, actively self-harming to what could be a lethal degree, or escalating behaviors, destruction of property, maybe like the impulsivity is so high that the family's worried they're going to run out of the house, then, those are going towards the police department because it's an immediate response. When we receive a phone call that's being triaged through crisis and it's escalated to that point, the crisis team is going to call the local police department or encourage the family to. It can be really challenging, I think, for families to determine where do I start. Families that have existing services, a lot of those services have an on-call number of their own. So some families aren't sure where to go. When you do reach the crisis team now with COVID, they're going to schedule a telehealth with a crisis clinician. Maybe, and Jen, I'm not sure if you've used those services throughout the pandemic. I'm not sure if that's happening faster or slower, because there's no travel time. But then again, our volume has increased so significantly that, I mean, I know from the receiving end, I'm getting called right away. Hey, we have an evaluation. When can you set it up for Zoom? And then the coordinator is reaching back out to the family and saying, hey, you'll receive a link, and then we just go from there. It's equally challenging for the clinician as it is for the family. Sometimes the person in crisis does not want to come on camera. There's a lot of, you see yourself, people don't want to see themselves crying or in agitated states and things like that. So the other component we have to take into consideration is, as the clinician, we are always assessing for safety and risk, but things may look like we can't de-escalate them via camera on Zoom. And again, that is when we may need to utilize 911 or calling the police department. But what you can expect right now is, if there's not a presence of immediate threat to safety, then you're going to get a Zoom link and a clinician to do a full evaluation. And then what my style is to be very transparent about what I'm thinking are the options. And I know that those can be triggering for some people because they fear hospitalization or they fear dismissal, that we're going to say, oh, no, things sound fine. I try to engage the family and any collateral supports that the family is okay with, including. and coming up with a plan. And circling back to the goal of our work is the lowest level of care. So we certainly don't want to jump to hospitalization, because as Jen described, like these clients can sit in an ER for just unreasonable amount of time due to shortage of beds. So we're going to brainstorm so many things during that assessment. Once we've seen what the full picture looks like, natural supports, are there family members, are there people that can step in to provide the parents a little relief, because it's a lot and we need to look at the whole system. It's not just the child, it's the family, it's the people caring for them. Do they have supports in school? And now school is different too, because it's not happening in person everywhere. And we're really trying to plug in every single thing we can, because whether or not it escalates a day later and they do need the hospital, there will be a day that they're discharged, that we want to make sure we pull together all possible resources and empower families to utilize them. So, you can expect that in addition to your full assessment, there's a lot of engagement with the family and the client about what would you like to see, how will you know things are different, and how can we get you there, and can us doing follow-up and scheduling it. Sometimes we're doing more than one check-in call a day the following day to get a sense of did he or she get up and go to school, are they what did this morning look like, and then another check-in later. We can do a variety of things, and we want to do that, and we want to do that to help stabilize and minimize these ER waits and the trauma that can come with that.
And I think, Cara, you brought it up a good point too, and I had forgotten about this, but we had boarded this summer and didn't get a bed and were discharged home. And one of the things I did was I ended up calling our local police department and getting in touch with the clinician who works. And I believe what her title is the jail diversion program as well. Not that I thought my son was going to go to jail, but being a mental health clinician, I spoke with her at length about my son's situation. And if we needed to call 911, the police and she knew of our case before they even walked through the door. So I just think too that proactive planning was huge for us. It brought me a complete sense of relief. And this December, we did have to call 911, and I have to say that the response from our local police and fire department was phenomenal. And I just think even that little bit of extra work you can do proactively. My son also has autism, so it was really important for them to know that he might have a typical reaction, and knowing that up front was so helpful. So I'm glad you jogged my memory about that.
That's a huge piece, and sometimes because I'm in the field, I forget to mention the importance of that. Prior to even working as a jail diversion clinician, I always made sure that we were utilizing community policing and things like that with people who may struggle more often. Advocates has 15 jail diversion programs at different police departments, and Southborough being one of them. Even if a clinician is not available, like you mentioned, there can be that component where the officers are very well trained. That's why our program exists, and our title can be confusing. Jail diversion, people think this is not, we divert from jail, from charges, and from the emergency department. And we still function as crisis clinicians. That's what we are. And then the difference that you described sounds like it was an imminent, immediate threat of safety. And you weren't likely to get your child safely to the ER without the support of a response. So the other piece to that is that we, I work for advocates, and these, Wayside is contracted with advocates, the mobile crisis, all part of advocates. And we communicate often. We put people on alert sometimes. That's a term we use. So say if Jen, you may have had an experience with this where things are sort of escalating and you just want to make sure people are like all hands on deck. Like if something should happen, that people are kind of aware of the family's situation and their preferences. The jail diversion programs are aware of that too. And I know that if I'm not going to be there, if I'm leaving on a Friday and there's no clinician over the weekend, I'll mention to dispatch and to the officers a name or an address that we've been working with, to give a heads up. So I'm glad that you brought that up from a parent perspective, because that can be so intimidating for so many reasons, and anything we can do to streamline and provide comfort and relief versus more stress and shame is the goal.
That's great. Jennifer, I know we have one more closing question, but I have one other question just because of how our conversation has gone. In thinking about your personal experience or any other conversations you've had with parents, are there any other things you think are worth mentioning? Things that when you say, I wish I had known this in the beginning, does anything else come to mind that you want other families to know that we can have Cara respond to while we have her here?
That there are choices, and that the mobile health clinicians can be very helpful in assessing what you need. So as a parent, you might, if you don't understand kind of the mental health system, and you think I'm worried about my son or daughter, I'm gonna take them to the emergency room and they're gonna get the help they need immediately. And I think that having someone from mobile crisis kind of walk you through your options in a very stepwise approach is so helpful, because I think we tend to kind of like see what's in the movies or what's on TV. They had a crisis, they went to the hospital, they got better. There's, like Cara said, hospital is stabilization. Hospital is not intensive therapy all day long to get you where you need to go. It is absolutely stabilization from your crisis, being safe to be able to come home and do all that work. So I think that that's really important, because I think it can be very frustrating for parents to get to someplace like an inpatient setting and think that a lot of things are going to be worked on in that setting. Certainly there are some things that are going to be worked on, but inpatient is for stabilization. And it's at home, or in a partial hospitalization, or in a intensive outpatient place that the real work gets done. And I think knowing that earlier on can possibly prevent an ER visit and boarding for a long time, like Cara said, and which is a real significant problem right now. So I would love for people to understand that that mobile crisis and their clinicians can provide a lot of guidance as to what is out there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Cara, in the last minute or two, do you have anything you'd like to add before we end?
I think that's just all wonderful points. And I try to use analogies that people can understand better from, it's sort of like you're looking at wound care versus surgery. And when you're inpatient, it's like surgery in the sense of like, you don't come home from surgery and go for, a run and stuff. You're still, you may be stepping down to, physical therapy and things like that. So when we look at mental health at that larger level, I mean, this is exactly, maybe a misconception that people think you come home all healed. So that's why as a crisis clinician, we want to stack resources. We want to make referrals. We want to encourage families to have natural supports and things like that, because the real work comes after stabilization. It's long-term work. It goes for forever. People are working on their wellness. So those were great points.
Wonderful. Well, ladies, thank you both so much for coming on the show today. It was such a fantastic conversation, really helpful for parents to hear. If anybody's watching and has questions, please feel free to send those to us. The show is over for today, but the discussion doesn't end here. We're happy to continue that. As we mentioned, next week, we're going to be talking about CBHI services, which again is Children's Behavioral Health Initiative, which has some really fantastic enhanced behavioral health supports for families who are experiencing some emerging mental health needs. And so we have Caitlin Gothorpe, who is from Advocates. No, she's not. I get these two mixed up. She is a clinical director at Wayside Youth and Family Support Network. My apologies, Caitlin. But we're going to be talking with her next week about CBHI more in depth and some of the specifics about how to access those services. So thank you again, ladies, for coming on, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.